All right. Hello, everyone. Can you all see and hear me? Excellent. Okay. Share the screen. Get ready to begin. Well, actually, only a single housekeeping thing today, just before we get into it. Um, I think that when it comes to next Tuesday's lecture, I am actually going to have to do that not live. The reason has to do with a guest speaker that I'm having in another class who I have to get up to the campus. Um, Another student and I have to shuttle him up here. And so rather than worry about juggling so many commitments that day, rather than having the lecture live, what I'll probably end up doing is pre-recording the remainder of this, basically. So God, like nature and existence, part two will not be live. It'll just be a YouTube video that I upload, and it'll go live when we would otherwise have the live lecture. So it's looking like that's what's going to happen. And then we'll, of course, be back for our last live lecture on Thursday, which will be like a wrap up. That way, I don't have to cancel any classes. That way, all of the learning materials that you need in order to have completed the course and to be ready for your final quiz will be available. Um, yeah, that's the announcement. Okay, everybody understand? And I'll probably post an announcement about this on Brightspace and in the Discord server so that people who aren't here right now or who don't watch the live lecture or the recording of the live lecture will be up to speed. But yeah, no problem. That is the extent of the heads up. Now you all have it. So, with that said, let us start talking about, I don't know, I suppose the biggest question. Um, a question that certainly I've pondered. One of the questions that probably led me to where I am, in fact, and that is, does God exist? And if God does exist, what is the nature of the divine? What is God like if he exists? Um, why would we ask a question like this in such a course as this one? Well, it is a metaphysical question, and Crumley points this out at the start of this chapter. Remember that metaphysics deals with what kinds of things that exist. We want to know what things exist, and we want to know what those things are like. Um, think about previous things that we've learned about, which we've discussed in metaphysical terms. Universals, things, beings, free will. We've pondered the nature of the mind, right? And now we're asking whether God exists, and if God does exist, what is God like? Now, one thing I always like to say ahead of time is, of course, that this can be maybe a sort of sensitive or provocative topic for some people, no matter what you believe. Right? There are believers who are very passionate about this topic. There are atheists who are very passionate about this topic, right? So I've never had a problem with this, but I do like to encourage everybody to be kind to one another when we're having a discussion like this, just because some of the questions that we're asking can really poke at, like, sort of deeply held beliefs that some people have. So some people might um, uh, take one of these positions. Some of you might self-identify as one of these. These are different. These are the names of different uh, sorts of ways that we can understand God's nature and existence, right? One of these views, um, which we actually get here in the creation of Adam, is theism. Theism, a theistic God, if you believe, if you are a theist, You believe that there is a God, firstly, and that God actually actively intervenes in creation. So here's God doing such a thing, creating Adam. Um, here he is, being carried by some angels, and here's Adam over here. Um, think of miracles. Think of answering prayers, right? This is what a theistic God does. So a theist is somebody who believes in this sort of God. Then there's deism. What is deism? Well, deism paints a picture of what Carl Sagan used to call a do-nothing God. Um, the deistic God is sometimes called the God of the philosophers or the watchmaker God. Why? Well, because on deism, God creates the universe, but he doesn't actively intervene in the universe. Um, this is why sometimes this is we think of this conception of God as like a watchmaker God, right? If the universe is like a vast clockwork mechanism, all the stars and planets going around stars, moons going around planets, creatures existing on planets are all like this is all like the machinery of nature, as it were. And God has created the machine. He's determined the rules by which it operates. But once he creates it and gets it going, he steps back and he doesn't really do anything. So a theistic God is a God that answers your prayers, a God that performs miracles. A deistic God is not. A deistic God doesn't really do anything after he's created the universe. Then there's polytheism, which we don't really talk about very much nowadays, do we? Um, but there are certain religions that are still practiced by many people that you could consider polytheistic. Um, for example, so I should say, when it comes to theism and deism, we're generally talking about a form of monotheism where we're talking about a single God. But on polytheism, there's many gods. Um, some interpretations of Hinduism, you can look at Hinduism as a polytheistic religion. You can also look at it as monotheistic, actually. There are different ways to look at it, but polytheism would be, the religion of the ancient Greeks, for example. Then there's pantheism. God is just nature. God is everything. Um, a related idea is panentheism. God is sort of like immanently present within everything. God is within nature. I'll be honest. I still have a tricky time understanding the real difference between pantheism and panentheism. I mean, if God is everything, then is God not already within everything? I don't know. But there are probably some experts on pantheism and panentheism who could explain the differences a lot better than I could. Then, of course, there's atheism, um, where you have two different sorts of flavors. Um, which we could characterize as strong and weak atheism, or agnosticism and anti-theism. Atheism, just what the word means, is without God or without gods, like atheos. Um, and usually that's understood as either a lack of belief in God or gods, or um, a belief that there is not a God or that there are no gods. Agnosticism is the weak form. So agnosticism, that comes from the Greek, without knowledge. Um, Notice we're talking a different kind of knowledge than the sort of knowledge we've been talking about so far in this course. Episteme, like understanding. Uh, Gnosis is a different notion of knowledge. And if you're an agnostic, you believe that we cannot know. So maybe you don't believe. That would make you a weak atheist. Um, Then there's anti-theism, which is a stronger position. Um, we disbelieve, we believe there is no God, or maybe we don't even want there to be a God. Maybe that would be bad. Maybe we don't want this divine presence watching over us all of the time. And there are some thinkers that do advocate for this position. But that's a general sort of overview of the various positions you'll find in this debate. Now, today, we're going to be mostly concerned with the first two. So, we're talking about theistic or deistic notions of God. So, a God that actively intervenes in the world, a theistic God, that is the God that we find in the Abrahamic religions. So, Judaism, Christianity, Islam are the big three. And in those religions, God actually does things, right? God talks to Moses in the form of a burning bush or delivers the commandments to him on the top of Mount Sinai. On Christianity, right? God sends his son famously. In Islam, I'm less familiar with Islam, but um, God still takes an active role, right, in creation. I mean, think of the night journey, right, where Muhammad has to uh, go and see God, right? He has to get on a winged horse and he goes up there and he meets the prophets and he talks with God, and God is like interacting with an important prophet there, right? So that's all examples of a theistic God, a God who takes an active role, right? Why do we call the God of the philosophers, or why do we call the deistic conception of God the God of the philosophers? That is because a lot of the philosophers we've studied look at God in this way as a sort of watchmaker. Um, you know, um, we've looked at Descartes. We haven't looked so much at many of the other Enlightenment thinkers. I mean, a little bit. We've looked at a little bit thinkers like Hume and Kant. Kant did believe in God, a sort of deistic God. Hume, maybe it's a little more questionable. I mean, certainly when you hear Hume talk about miracles, um, he seems to have either a deistic God in mind or sim simply he was just an atheist. Um, We haven't talked much about Spinoza, but Spinoza was a pantheist or a panentheist. But the god of the philosophers, this watchmaker god, is a deistic god. A lot of philosophers talk about him that way, and that's why we call this conception of God the god of the philosophers. But usually, and perhaps this is especially true of theistic conceptions of God, um, we usually understand this being God, whatever it is, to possess a certain number of divine attributes, which we're going to look at in turn today. And these are omnipresence, so being everywhere, omniscience, that's all knowing, uh, omnipotence, all powerful. Um, God has eternality, so he's always existed. And God is immutable, so God doesn't change. And there's another one. A sixth one, omnibenevolence. God is supposed to be all good, but we're going to bracket this one and look at it in more detail when we discuss the problem of evil. Okay, omnipresence. If you're omnipresent, that means you're everywhere all of the time. Um, Now, of course, on panentheism, God is everywhere such that he's in everything and everything is in him. So this is like um, an immanent God. God is immanent in all things. Um, you, me, the objects and other life forms in the world itself, right? Um, God is in everything and everything is in him. That's the sense in which God is omnipresent on panentheism. More simply on pantheism, and again, I'm not entirely sure how to properly understand this difference. But God just is everything. So, there's the sense in which God is omnipresent on pantheism is just that he just is the sum total of existence. Um, so of course God is everywhere because everything is God. Um, but theistic and deistic interpretations of God's omnipresence differ from this a little bit. Aquinas understood omnipresence analogically, and what he meant was that saying that God is omnipresent is a way of analogizing the extent of his knowledge and power. Um, so you could say that God is everywhere in the sense that nothing is outside of his knowledge or his power. Anything that can be known, God knows it. Anything that can be done, God can do it. So God might not be literally everywhere, but his knowledge and power extends everywhere. And that's the sense in which he's omnipresent. And that's because this God, Aquinas's God, is 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 uh is non-physical, right? So he's not literally present everywhere, just as he's not literally in a single spot in space and time. Um, you can draw a further analogy here, which I think is quite helpful. And this is Crumley's analogy. You can think of God as similar to the laws of nature, right? The laws of nature are present throughout the whole universe. Anywhere in the universe you go, the speed of light remains the same. Um, the gravitational constant is the same. Um, the laws don't change based on where you go. Uh, in in the similar sense, God is present everywhere, in that his knowledge or power extends everywhere, rather like the laws of nature do. So that's omnipresence. Any questions about omnipresence? I heard an interesting joke once about God's omnipresence. A professor had remarked that it must be awfully tiring being omnipresent because you have to be everywhere all of the time. And one of our wittier students um, replied, "Well, if you're omnipresent, that means you're also always on vacation. So it's probably not that bad." All right, let's talk about omniscience. What is it to be omniscient? To be omniscient is to be all-knowing. So if God is omnipresent because his knowledge extends everywhere, like on Aquinas' conception, then God also knows all. Everything that there is to know, God knows it. And again, going back to Thomas Aquinas, um, uh, one of the ways that we can understand this is to compare the sort of ways that God knows with the ways that we know. Um, Aquinas said that our knowledge is mediated by reasons. There are reasons why we come to know things. We've studied those very reasons in this class, like when we looked at the difference between knowledge and belief early on in September. We come to know things um, by sense experience, by reason. Um, but God's knowledge is unmediated. So we could say that God's knowledge is direct. So all knowledge, which is all truths, um, are immediately available to God, as opposed to ourselves, right? We have to learn and discover. But if you're God and you're omniscient in the sense that everything that is available to know is directly available to you. You could also describe God's knowledge as intuitive, all right? On this conception, right? It's unmediated by reasons. God just knows. So it's intuitive in that sense, where we need to reason through things, where we need to employ concepts. God sort of just knows, right? Any questions about omniscience? Okay, we're flying through this a little quickly. Um, if you have questions, do stop me. Omnipotence. To be omnipotent is to be all powerful. Um, One way that we often put this is that God can do anything. Another is that if there's anything that can be done, God can do it. There might be, therefore, some limitations on God's power. Now, you might say, hang on, wouldn't that make him not omnipotent? Well, not necessarily. Um, some theologians have argued that God can't do the logically impossible. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, could God make a square circle? Could God make a colorless red object? These theologians would say no, but that's not because of a limitation of God's power. It's because those things are just logically impossible. You can't have a square circle. If you turn your circle into a square, it is just a square. You can't have a colorless red object. It's got to be red or colorless. Um, so God can't do the logically impossible. God cannot make a married bachelor. Um, God cannot make um, an uncle with no nieces and nephews, right? So it's not a limitation to say that God cannot do the logically impossible because logically impossible things are just impossible. But God could still do the physically impossible things. So miracles, right? Um, so that's why these theologians say that we're not really limiting God's power by saying that he can't do the logically impossible. Um, but he can do the physically impossible. If we limited the physically impossible, we'd be in terms of what God could do, the limit what he could do in terms of the physical, then sure, but not with the logical. Well, and that's a good point, Yusuf. Uh, and this is where certain religious traditions kind of diverge a little bit, right? Um, like the scholastic philosophers of the Middle Ages in Europe thought that we could understand quite a bit about God. Interestingly, by by referring to the work of pagan philosophers like Aristotle, right? I mean, Thomas Aquinas thought that Aristotle had figured out a lot about God, even though Aristotle was a mere pagan, right? But then, of course, on some religious traditions, certain mystical um, branches of various religions, um, God is just ultimately mysterious, and maybe he could do these things, um, but they're just so far beyond our comprehension that um, our tiny little minds can't grasp how it is possible that God could make a square circle if he wanted to, right? But in any case, this is how Crumley treats it, right? Generally, kind of uh, following this idea that, oh, excuse me, following this idea that um, it's not really a limitation to say that God can't do the logically impossible. But then, we can carry on with our discussion of the physically impossible. Um, sure, God should be able to perform physically impossible things like miracles. But then, if God can do the physically impossible, do we still run into contradictions or areas of confusion when it comes to what he can actually do in terms of the physical? I mean, there's that old chestnut, could God make a rock so big that even he couldn't lift it? Either way, it seems like there's something he can't do. Um, so if God can make a rock that big, then there is something he can't do, namely lift the rock. But if he can lift the rock, then he cannot make a rock so big that he cannot lift it. And then of course there's a question here. Is this a matter of physical impossibility or logical impossibility? It sounds pretty physical, but I don't know. Um, there's a little bit of a logical contradiction here too. So in order to dispense with confusing little questions like this one, we could just say that God is maximally powerful, right? God could do anything, Aquinas would say, um, except uh, something that violates his nature. So God perhaps cannot break the rules that he sets out for himself to follow. Maybe those are the rules of logic, right? So maybe God could create a square circle, but he won't because it's a rule that he doesn't want to break. Or, could God do something evil? If God is omnibenevolent, could God do something evil? You might say, well, no, he couldn't because he's all good. Um, okay, but then there's something that he cannot do. So he's not all powerful. We'll come back to this question next time when we talk about the problem of evil. Okay, any questions so far? We're doing really well for time. I'm just worried that I'm moving through this too quickly. Then again, the class is really thinning out now. Only 50 people here today, so perhaps people who would have otherwise had questions are, I don't know, sleeping. No, that's okay, Yusuf. You can say what you need to say. Um, can I repeat the point about omnibenevolence? Absolutely. So we're asking whether there's something God cannot do, right? If there are limits on God's powers, God's abilities. If God is all good, then um, he cannot do evil because he's all good. He's omnibenevolent. But that means he's not omnipotent because there's something that he can't do, namely evil. And a lot of this scholarship really seems to be about working out how all of these divine attributes can exist together without contradiction. So we want to say God is all powerful. Okay, what does that mean? Does that mean he can um, uh, violate the laws of logic? He can do the logically impossible. Well, some say no, and some say he could, but he doesn't, right? Same with evil. Perhaps God could do evil, but chooses not to. Yeah, Lisa, that's another point that we're going to come back to next time when we talk about the problem of evil, how free will enters into the picture. And um, yeah, Yusuf, please, if you want to say something, I encourage it. I'd like to get the discussion going. Let's see. If God can't do anything evil, why is there evil in the world? Well, yeah, well, this is the problem of evil, right? It's a problem, right? So, and I don't want to get ahead of myself because we are going to talk about this next time. Although next time is going to be like just me talking to a camera. So I would encourage you, you know what you could all do is watch it together, and you could maybe type in the Discord server your thoughts as the lecture goes. That might be fun. But yeah, Caleb, that's right. Um, that's where we're going to go with to try and save this Omni. Oh, hey, that's a good idea, Galen. Yeah, I can do a YouTube premiere. That's what we'll do. Yeah, that's what we'll do. Good idea. Thank you. So yeah, but basically, yeah, Yusuf is asking, well, if God is all good, why is there evil? And that's the problem of evil. And there are two sorts of versions. One is the logical problem of evil, and one is the evidential problem of evil. And we're going to be looking at both of them. So the logical problem of evil is simply that there's a contradiction between the existence of evil and a benevolent God. So either God um, is not omnibenevolent because he allows evil, or um, he is omnibenevolent, but he's either not all powerful or he doesn't exist. That's the logical problem. The evidential problem says, and of course, the response to this is Alvin Plantinga, right? Who says, well, no, God gave us free will, so there's going to be some evil. Some of us are going to elect to do evil, right? But then there's the evidential problem of evil, where you say, okay, well, sure, we've got free will, so some of us are going to do evil, but isn't there just like a little too much evil? I mean, maybe there have to be moral evils since we have free will. But what about natural evils? Why does God have to either send a flood to kill people or allow a flood to kill people? Couldn't he have made it so that fewer people died? Right? That's the evidential problem of evil. And we'll talk about those things in detail next time. Um, Well, maybe Yusuf. Like I said, we'll be able to get into this in more detail next time. But um, so I'll come back to that. I'm just going to get to Caleb's question here. Uh, could it be that he is capable of evil but chooses not to engage in it? Well, that's interesting, right? Because if he were capable of evil, then would he still be omnibenevolent? I mean, what makes him omnibenevolent? Is it that he can commit evil but chooses not to? Or is it that he is incapable of doing evil? And I'm not going to be able to give you a solid answer because, well, theologians have been arguing about this for centuries. Um, I mean, I can give you my opinion. Yeah. It really, I mean, this is why this is so philosophical. It really does depend on what we mean by the words we're using. So a lot of this we're arguing about what does it mean to be omnibenevolent or omnipotent? Like, what does it really mean? Does it mean, you know, he could do evil but chooses not to? Or that does it mean that he could never do evil, even if he wanted to? Hmm. What's my opinion? Well, I'm an atheist. Um, I, I, I I guess I fall under the weak atheist umbrella, right? Um, I think ultimately, um, at least right now, I can't really know. And so I live my life in a sort of godless sort of way. Um, you know, I don't, uh, I don't worship anything. Um, I guess where a lot of people have religion, instead I have philosophy. Um, so I engage with a lot of the same questions that people who believe in God do, albeit in somewhat different way. Could this be applied to the story of the Tower of Babel? Um, you mean you mean maybe it was evil that God sundered the speech of everyone, or or were we being evil by building the tower? I'm not really sure what you mean. But yeah, could you tell us more there, Khalid? Well, Lawrence, that's right. And we kind of touched upon this um, when we talked about free will, and we used the example of Laplace's demon, right? If God knows what I'm going to do, then am I still free, or am I in some sense determined? And if I am determined, um, well, then what happens to my moral responsibility? Then, of course, other people would say just because God knows, that doesn't mean you're determined. Maybe God knows what you would do, not what you will do, right? Yeah, I'm not sure because I'm not sure, Khalid. There's also the problem of I almost said the problem of evil, but really the problem of what that word means. Because evil is a a religious sort of idea. Um, and we use it in place of morally wrong all the time, but they don't necessarily mean the same thing. Maybe a better question is to ask if God could do something morally wrong. Um, because definitionally, God doesn't do evil because evil is what is opposed to God. But does God still do things that we might say are wrong? Yeah, totally. He kills people. Um, so yeah, part of the problem might be the terminology. Yeah, there's one way you can look at it, Caleb. Like if God has foreknowledge, then he could be like the director of a movie, right? He knows the script, but he doesn't know how the actors will perform, as you say. That's a nice way of putting it. And that could be a way to make sense of it. Okay, good discussion. We'd better move on to eternality. So what does it mean to say that God is eternal? Well, it means that God has always existed and always will exist. But there's a couple of different ways to understand that, to understand what that means. It might mean that God exists within time, in which cases, his eternality means that he stretches infinitely backward and forward in time. Um, but God could also be eternal in the sense that he's outside of time, so he's timeless. So time is something that happens within the universe, but God is kind of outside of the universe. And so all moments are sort of available to him. In a lot of religions, of course, it is supposed that God acts within time. So again, the Abrahamic religions, whenever God does a miracle, Uh, he does this within time, right? He visits people, he does miracles, he gets people to perform miracles, he sends messages to people. And in Christianity, he's even supposed to have become a person, um, and been executed, right? So these things all straightforwardly occur within time. Um, so at least on the conception of God that we get in the Abrahamic religions, um, if God is timeless, it's because he's eternal within time, not outside of time. So he's always existed, he always will exist, and when he intervenes, he does so in time. But if God is outside of the universe, how would that work? It sounds like deism, right? God creates the universe and just leaves it alone, lets the universe go. Um, where is he? Not here, not within space, nor within time. And if this is the sort of God you believe in, you might very well be a deist, which is fine. Um, here you believe maybe that God has created this giant clockwork universe that we live in. He's established all of the laws of nature. He's set the clockwork mechanism running and then let it go. Of course, Aquinas did say that perhaps God has decided everything from eternity. We don't need to see him as acting in time, even when he does intervene. So maybe he's outside of time and he's decided, just to use a story from the Old Testament, he's decided that he will have, I don't know, Moses part the Red Sea, when the Israelites are escaping from Egypt, say. Um, so even if it looks like he's come down and helped Moses do that, he's already decided from an eternal sort of atemporal point of view that that is what is going to happen. So that would be kind of like God keeping his own schedule, right? He's atemporal, but oh, okay, the time has come. I've got to go and get back to the universe and help Moses part the Red Seas. So he's decided that it looks like he's acting in time. Uh, he is intervening, but it's been decided that that's what will happen atemporally, if that makes sense. I think they might say that, yeah. Like I've been calling a deistic God the God of the philosophers, but he could just as well be the God of a great many scientists. After all, if you think about the Big Bang Theory, where space and time begin at the Big Bang. Um, so imagine we're dealing with a deistic God. Um, we could say that at that moment, that is when he created time in addition to space. Um, and again, he himself is outside of time. So he's atemporal in the sense that maybe for God, for this sort of God, there is no time. There's time for us because we're in the universe where there is time, but God is atemporal because he's outside of that. Yeah, I think that's something deists could plausibly argue. Let's talk about immutability. So the idea here is that God just doesn't change. God is supposed to be perfect, so why would he change? And this really goes back to Plato. This is another one of those ideas of Plato's that has influenced uh, especially Christian thought. Um, After all, Plato's forms were perfect and immutable, and so is God, right? And Saint Augustine, Boethius, Aquinas, they all agree on that the immutability of God. So God doesn't change. Why should he? He's already perfect. A related notion, albeit somewhat weaker, is incorruptibility. Um, so this is weaker in that it's saying that there can be no changes to God's character. Um, God is incorruptible. God is not going to become evil one day, right? Um, another another related idea is impassibility. So this says that God is not susceptible to mental states that we have. Um, God is not susceptible to emotions or to feelings. Um, if you want to see what the opposite looks like, look at certain polytheistic religions where gods are corruptible and passible. So, like the Greek gods, there are absolutely changes to um, the characters of certain gods. They definitely are susceptible to their emotions. Um, Even in the Old Testament, God describes himself as a jealous God. And that's probably because this is a time when, there's a sort of monotheism emerging from a polytheistic background. Um, but yeah, if you think of a polytheistic religion like the religion of the ancient Greeks, Zeus, for example, is totally corruptible and passable. I mean, he's always falling in love and trying to seduce some mortal woman. Oftentimes, there's a lack of consent on the part of the woman. Um, and that's not the kind of God that we're talking about when we talk about an immutable God. Then again, on the Islamic tradition, which is where we're probably most of us are probably the one most of us are the most familiar with, it's not clear the extent of God's immutability. Um, Abraham has to negotiate with God to try and spare Sodom and Gomorrah in case he can find a few good people. Muhammad negotiates the number of prayers from 50 down to five. Um, so these are examples of at least attempts to change God's mind about something, right? Um, so I don't know. I don't know how important this notion of immutability is. I don't know the extent to which God is supposed to be immutable. Maybe the whole notion is a little suspect, but I think it's interesting to talk about. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, that's nice, Ivy. Nice. Yeah, because we have the idea of God that somebody like Aquinas is dealing with is changed over time, right? The God of the Old Testament seems quite different um, than the God of the philosophers. Um, Perhaps more similar to a God that we'd find in a polytheistic pantheon. Yeah, very interesting. Hmm. Okay, let's see. I know that we're doing pretty good for time. I can't remember how many slides I have left. Let's take a look just to make sure that I don't 19. Wow, I doozy. Well, let's begin taking a look at three of the arguments for God's existence. Um, one is the design argument, also known as the teleological argument. Now, there are a number of different versions of this argument, but each of them state that there's enough evidence out there when we look around the world to conclude that there's design in nature. And the argument goes, if something is designed, it must have a purpose or an end. And if there's design and a purpose, so purposeful design, we should say, then there must have been a designer. And the conclusion is that this is God. Therefore, we have some evidence for the existence of God. That's the design argument in a nutshell. It's an a posteriori argument. It's an empirical argument. We look around, we observe ostensibly design in the natural world, and then we infer on that basis the existence of a designer. Um, Lots of examples we can find. Um, the ends of creatures in nature, their telos, right? Um, Aristotle. Uh, this is one of his arguments. The nature of the body, evidence of design in the body, or the structure of our DNA. The most famous articulation comes from William Paley, however, and I'm going to read this bit in its entirety. This is from the introduction of Paley's book. In crossing a heath, suppose I pitched my foot against a stone, and were asked how the stone came to be there. I might possibly answer that, for anything I knew to the contrary, it had lain there forever. Nor would it perhaps be very easy to show the absurdity of this answer. So, if you're walking around a field and you find a rock, you wonder how it got there. Well, it was probably just sitting there for a long time. Um, and it would be hard to show otherwise. But to continue, but suppose I had found a watch upon the ground, and it should be inquired how the watch happened to be in that place. I should hardly think of the answer I had given before, that it had just been there forever, that for anything I knew, the watch might have always been there. Yet why should not this answer serve as a watch, as well as for the stone? Why is it not as admissible in the second case as in the first? For this reason and no other. When we come to inspect a watch, we perceive, what we could not discover in the stone, that its several parts are framed and put together for a purpose. There must have existed at some time and at some place or other an artificer or artificers who formed it for the purpose which we find it actually to answer, who comprehended its construction and designed its use. Every indication of contrivance, every manifestation of design which existed in the watch, exists in the works of nature, with the difference on the side of nature of being greater or more, and that in a degree which exceeds all computation. So that is Paley's articulation of the teleological argument. If you found a watch sitting in the middle of a field, you would assume the existence of a watchmaker. But really, the design in nature, Paley is saying, is far greater, or the evidence for design in nature is far greater than, a single watch. So we ought to infer a designer, infer the existence of a designer on the basis of the design that we see in nature. That's the argument. Samar, if you were a deist, would you still believe God created the first human? Not necessarily. In fact, I would probably say no. Um, but it's possible. Um, I guess it depends on how you look at the universe, right? A deist who thinks that God just, you know, kicked off the Big Bang. Well, humans don't appear on the scene for like another, what, 13 and a half billion years. So if you're that kind of deist, and you believe in an old universe, I would say no. But I don't know. See, now that we're post-Darwin, not a lot of deists would believe that we were created as we are now, is the problem. Maybe pre-Darwin, you could find some deistic philosophers who believed that God made us as we are and then left us alone. But after Darwin, no. Do deists believe God created everything at once and didn't do anything else after? More or less, that's the impression I get. It's kind of like, you know how you can get those kits and they're like little kits where you can build a little clockwork mechanism of some kind. You could build a little mechanical um, merry-go-round or an orrery or any number of things. You can get them at those nerdy stores that sell all the nerdy stuff. What's the one? There's one in the Rito Center, um, Imaginaire, and there was one before that in a different location that I remember had them. I was going to buy one, but then the store went out of business. But it was called Masterminds or something. Anyway, uh, it's like this little kit you could put together, and it had a whole bunch of gears and wheels and mind games. That was the one. Thank you, Claire. Mind games. And you could build these little kits, so you could build like your own little, maybe a merry-go-round or maybe some kind of clock, and you just put it together. It's like that. Once God has put it all together and starts it going, then he steps back and he's done and doesn't do anything else. Um, so would they say once we're something different, but we've evolved into what we are now? Well, again, it depends. It depends on who we're talking about. I think any deist now has to contend with Darwin and the theory of evolution, right? So, sure, God created the universe, but he didn't create everything as it is now. But he created a universe where one day life would evolve, and more specifically, human beings would evolve, right? Now, pre-Darwin, there might have been deists who thought we were created as we were, or as we are. But after Darwin, I don't think so. Although there are still lots of theists who think that. Yeah. Mm. So anyway, to get back to Paley, Paley's is probably the most famous um, example of the design of the design argument. But another version is the fine-tuning argument. The idea here is that the universe is tuned just right for life. Maybe if things were just a little bit different, if the universe weren't as finely tuned as it is, then maybe there would be no life. But not everyone accepts this line of reasoning. I personally think that maybe there still would be life. Perhaps it would just be a lot different than than life as we know it. Probably one of the most famous contemporary answers to Paley and the design argument comes from Richard Dawkins. who wrote in his book, The Blind Watchmaker, Paley's argument is made with passionate sincerity and is informed by the best biological scholarship of Paley's day, but it is wrong, gloriously and utterly wrong. The analogy between watch and living organism is false. All appearances to the contrary, the only watchmaker in nature is the blind force of physics, albeit deployed in a very special way. Natural selection, the blind, unconscious, automatic process which Darwin had discovered, and which we now know is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life, has not purpose in mind. It does not plan for the future. It has no vision, no foresight, no sight at all. If it can be said to play the role of watchmaker in nature, it is the blind watchmaker. What Dawkins is doing here is sort of deploring Darwin's discovery of evolution by natural selection in a way that calls into question the notion that this design that we observe in nature actually requires intention. David Hume actually does something similar centuries earlier. He says, we humans might have a lot of experience when it comes to designing artifacts, but none of us has experience when it comes to designing universes. So who are we to say, oh, look at all of this evidence of design? The radical empiricist Hume is saying, well, how do you know? Um, that what you think you see as evidence of design in nature is really evidence of design because you have never designed a universe, mister. Um, that's so Hume is great, first of all. Um, and I mean, Dawkins has a point, right? What Dawkins is saying is that uh, you know, we might see something in nature that looks purposeful, but it's not purposeful in the sense that it's designed with intention. Rather, what looks like intentional design to us is the result of the blind design of natural selection, where things evolve in such a way, not because, any mind intended them to turn out that way, but rather because um, those ways of being simply conferred some adaptive advantage in the organism. Now, some would disagree with Dawkins on this. Some would say we can still say that there's purpose in nature, even if it's not intentional or even if it's not intelligent design. So Ernst Mayr would say that this purpose that we observe in nature is a result of something we call teleonomy rather than teleology. Ultimately, what Paley was saying is quite Aristotelian, right? We see design in nature. Okay. We see purposeful design in nature. This is very Aristotelian. Aristotle, you'll remember, thought that one of the four causes that you need to understand in order to understand something, anything, is the final cause or the telos. What is something's purpose? This works for artifacts, but when it comes to the natural world, what Aristotle is actually doing is committing something called the natural fallacy. Um, Aristotle looked at the world and thought, okay, the flies around the lagoon might be annoying, but they're there to feed the frogs, and the frogs are there to feed the birds, and the birds are there to look awesome, I guess. This just for example's sake. Um, That's teleology. But Mayer is saying it, well, what we've got here when we see apparent purpose in nature is not teleology, but teleonomy. Organisms behave purposely because they're following a sort of law-like uh, well, they're following laws of biology, laws of physics, etc. That's where this nomi comes from nomos or laws. So we see this apparent purpose because organisms might be following their genetic program, right? Um, and this goes from the very small parts of life forms to the larger parts of life forms. Like my RNA has a purpose. I have RNA in my body. It's called messenger RNA. Um, Everybody found out what messenger RNA was when we got those fancy new COVID vaccines. Remember those? What did they do? Well, they would put some messenger RNA in the vaccine, which would go into your cells. And basically, this RNA was like a set of instructions, and it would say to your cells, "Hey, make this spike protein, okay?" And so your cells made that protein. It was the same protein that the virus uses to get into your cells and infect you. So now your body's making the spike protein, and your immune system can recognize it and train your immune system to fight off COVID if you get COVID, right? But we all of us have messenger RNA in our bodies uh, all the time, and what it's doing is it's delivering instructions to different cells to do various things. So it has a purpose, but that purpose is defined by my genetic code. Um, Larger scale, my hand. My hand seems to have a purpose for picking up coffee cups, for example, to offer um, clarification and examples of philosophical concepts. Um, it seems like it's got a purpose, right? It's for grasping things, for manipulating things. Um, and sure, it has a purpose because my hands are the way they are because of my genes. Either way you slice it, there are serious problems with the design argument. Either the designer is blind, and so there's no purposeful design, or there is a sort of purposeful design, but it's teleonomic, not teleological. So there are some obstacles that people who advocate for this argument have to deal with. And people seriously do still deploy this argument. It was not that long ago, in the early 2000s, um, when there was actually a court case in the United States, went all the way to the Supreme Court that had to do with efforts to introduce intelligent design into the science curriculum, into biology class. Now, this ultimately failed, but it turned on basically the design argument. I personally have no problem teaching this in a class like this one, uh, but I do agree that it should not be anywhere near a biology classroom. And really, it was a sort of wedge issue. Do you know how divisive and partisan everything is now in American politics? The left versus the right. Well, this was at a time when we weren't quite as partisan, but the effort was still there. This was a wedge issue, meant to try and sneak in um, religious ideology in the public school system. I think the name of the trial was, or the title, I don't know what lawyers call it. It was Tammy Kitzmiller et al. Versus the Dover School Board, or the Dover trial. Look it up, and you'll see. You'll see that uh, the folks who wanted to introduce this stuff into high school biology were, and all of the scholarship on intelligent design they were drawing from. It's all this. It's all the design argument. And it all suffered from the same sort of problems that Paley's argument suffered from. But it was quite a public, sort of spectacle for a bit. It was a big part of the zeitgeist in the early 2000s, and one of the things that got me interested in philosophy. Okay, we got about 10 minutes left. I wonder if we can finish. Hmm. Well, we'll try. Or actually, should we save this for next time? I don't know. I feel like I think I've got time to cover it all next time. And I'll be honest with you all, I'm super tired today. We're getting near the end of the term, and I'm just not firing on all cylinders. So maybe we'll finish and maybe I can put this bit into the recording that I'm going to create for next week. Yeah, let's do, yeah, yeah. Oh, well, so we'll pause here, but I can try and answer your question, Yusuf. What is it that you don't quite understand? Is it like one of the steps in the argument? Like how do we get from design to God exists? Is it like that? Well, basically the idea is, I'll try and sketch it out as quickly as I can. When we look around in nature, we see um, design, and not only design, but purposeful design. And this implies the existence of a designer. So we infer the existence of a designer based on the design we apparently observe in nature. Uh, and the idea is that that designer is God. And that's basically it. That the world is it looks designed enough and purposeful enough that it requires a designer. And who else would that be but God? That's the, in a nutshell, the design argument. Does it have to have been God? I guess not. Um, Maybe life on Earth was designed by aliens. I don't know. Like like that movie Prometheus, right? Ridley Scott, right? There are those engineers in the beginning, that one engineer, he like drinks some liquid and then he like disassembles and goes into the river, and I guess that's he's the building blocks of life on Earth. Um so uh, that's a different sort of design. That's a sort of, I'm hesitant to use the term, but a sort of ancient alien sort of design. Um, so it doesn't have to be God, but most people assume or infer that if there's a designer, it's God. Yeah. Or maybe it's computers. Yeah. Maybe we're in, if and again, I'm hesitant to get into this. But, if reality is mere simulation, then yeah, maybe we're at the mercy of some kind of vastly intelligent AI that's designed our reality, like the Matrix. Um, but but putting those possibilities aside, the design argument is basically like, look, if you found a watch sitting in out there in the middle of nowhere, you would assume the existence of a watchmaker. But what Paley is saying is that the design in nature far exceeds the design of a watch, which implies the existence of a designer of nature. And who else would that be but God? That's the basic gist of it. Does that help, Yusuf? Okay, perfect. Well, we're finishing 5 minutes early, but I'm okay with that. And I think I can squeeze in the cosmological argument on the next lecture. So we'll pick up where we left off. I'll talk about the cosmological argument, and then we're going to talk about the ontological argument, and then we'll talk about the problem of evil. I'll post an announcement to make sure that everybody knows that we're not going to have a live lecture, but I will do it as a premiere on YouTube, as I think it was Galen suggested. And then that way there'll be a chat. And at the very least, you'll be able to talk amongst yourselves. And if I'm able to, I'll hop in the chat and I'll try and answer questions. If not, maybe I can answer them in the comment section or on the Discord server. So I will see you on Tuesday. All right. Have a good weekend, everybody. Bye bye for now.